So if you have all those biographies and stories on Padre Pio, you probably heard or read somewhere along the way that there was this mystic in San Giovanni Rotondo who prophesied really Padre Pio's arrival in her hometown. Pretty average woman in many different ways, but she was extraordinary in the faith.
Let me ask you a question. Have you ever heard of a young woman named Lucia Fiorentino? Did you know that young Lucia gave her life as a victim soul to save Padre Pio? And it apparently worked. God accepted her sacrifice in the 1930s. And we're going to have a conversation with Bret Thoman coming up at 30 past the hour about someone you probably have never heard of, but will blow your mind in the life of Saint Padre Pio. All of that today on the program.
By the way, my name is Joe McLean. I host a radio program called A Catholic Take, where we look at the world through a Catholic lens. I'd love for you to hang out with us. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below.
But I'm always fascinated to learn new things about St. Padre Pio, and I have recently learned about somebody I didn't even know existed before, Lucia Fiorentino, a young woman who gave her life to save Padre Pio. And this is an amazing story. And I've invited Bret Thoman on to be on. He's written a bunch of books, translated a bunch of books on the life of St. Padre Pio and many, many more. And he joins us now. Good morning to you, Bret. Happy Easter. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Briefly, how did you discover St. Padre Pio? You were not raised Catholic, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. And I think I can relate to what you just said about being chased down by Padre Pio. So Puglia, the region where Padre Pio is from, is south of here, about 300 kilometers, 200 miles. My wife is from that region. We got married about 22 years ago, and being from Puglia, you just can't get away from Padre Pio because his image is everywhere, statues, not just in churches, but in houses, and you see him on the wall, you see him everywhere. So when I met Katya, got married 22 years ago, I was Catholic, had been Catholic for a few years. I had heard a little bit about Padre Pio, but didn't know much about him. We did go there, I think, on 2 different occasions before we were married, and we went through the tour of the San Giovanni Rotondo Church. And I learned a little bit about him, but honestly, back then, I thought there was a little bit of maybe fanaticism, the sort of over-the-top devotion. I didn't understand it. About 2 or 3 years after that, we were in the U.S. I was a pilot at the time, and my wife was here in Italy, and I had a dream. And in the dream, Padre Pio came to me. I was lying on my right side, and he said, not verbally, but I understood him saying he wanted to touch my hand. I sort of held up my left hand as I was lying on my right side, and he said, no, your right hand. So I kind of turned over and held up my right hand. He touched it and then disappeared, and I was fully awake. So I say it was a dream. It may have been a dream. It might have been what we call nocturnal visitations. A nocturnal visitation is something that's objective. A separate reality comes to us in the form of a divine spirit, such as a saint or Christ himself. And I believe this was Padre Pio coming to me externally, objectively, and wanting to do something with me. It took some time, I think, before I understood what that meant. And I'm still not 100% sure I know what it meant, or even if I can be 100% sure it wasn't just a dream and it was a nocturnal visitation. I do know Padre Pio appears to people often in dreams. He also appears to people often through the scent of flowers and roses. And I had that experience separately down in San Giovanni Rotondo. Also, there was one third experience I had with Padre Pio that happened in between those 2 events, and that was at an exhibit of relics, the treasures of the church by Father Carlos Martins, who travels around North America with this very extensive collection of first-class relics. And he said in his introduction to the presentation, he said, go out into the hall where the different relics were, and they're named by the saint who they represent or whose body parts they are. And there's a little brief explanation of the saint. I'm a third order Franciscan, so I went straight to St. Francis. And I kind of held it to my heart, which is what Father Carlos said. And he said, see if anything happens, see if you're spoken to in some way. So I held St. Francis's relic to my heart, and I didn't really feel much. St. Clare was nearby. I saw the relic of St. Clare. I held her to my heart, and I kind of felt a little sensation of something. I said, okay, well, that's fine. And then I saw Padre Pio, and I remembered the dream I had. So I went over to the Padre Pio relic. I took it, and I placed it to my heart, and I felt something that was a physical, almost like a pulse, almost like I was pushed. And it was so strong, almost like an electric jolt. It was so strong, I took the relic away and brought it away from my heart. And I said, whoa, that was strong. And I brought it back again. I felt it again. So, and then later I had this, I smelled the roses. And I was in the old ancient church of San Giovanni Rotondo, where near the confessional where Padre Pio used to confess the women. And I was in there for a few minutes. There was nobody else there. It was during the winter, and there was no one there. And after about 3 or 4 minutes, I smelled perfume, rose perfume, so strong. It felt like somebody was like spraying it under my nose.
Wow.
And there was no doubt. Sometimes you smell roses. Is that roses or not? If it's really a mystical perfume, there's no doubt. And then I was meeting one of the last remaining spiritual sons of Padre Pio, was still living, and for Mass, which was at 11 o'clock. So I went with him. He came in, went to the 11 o'clock Mass at the Our Lady of Grace Church, the larger church. And at the consecration of the Holy Eucharist, I smelled the roses again, and it was just so strong. And I leaned over to Adolfo, is his name, and I said, "You smell roses?" And he said, "No, not at all." And his wife was behind us. I said, "Is your wife wearing rose fragrance perfume?" He said, actually, he didn't answer the second time. He just smiled, and he said, "Never doubt the ways of Padre Pio."
Lucia Fiorentino, she has such a deep and profound connection to Saint Padre Pio. Why don't you just give us like her general about her bio? Who was she? When did she live? What was the general timeline of her life?
Yeah, so she was born 2 years after Padre Pio in San Giovanni Rotondo. Pretty average woman in many different ways in the world, in worldly ways, but she was extraordinary in the faith. So if you have all those biographies and stories on Padre Pio, you probably heard or read somewhere along the way that there was this mystic in San Giovanni Rotondo who prophesied really Padre Pio's arrival in her hometown. And she's mentioned in all the classical biographies. They say her name, but that's all you ever hear about her is what she saw. So she saw had a vision of this large tree that was going to be that was going to grow up in the atrium of the convent. The atrium would be the courtyard of the convent, the friary of Padre Pio, of the Capuchins, which was about 2.5 kilometers up away from town. And back then in the 1920s and early 20s, early 30s, it was a mule track. So just like a dirt road that connected the Capuchin complex to the town. So nobody went up there really except for super devotees of St. Francis. But she said she saw this giant tree that was going to be growing inside the atrium of the complex. And a friar would come, and he would be represented by this tree, a priest. And the people from San Giovanni Rotondo and the foreigners use that term, forestieri, so outsiders would come in and take refuge underneath the umbrage of this tree and be immersed in a spirituality and be saved through it. So, and then she heard a voice and said, "This tree represents a priest who will come." So she had a vision and a voice, a vision and a locution. She didn't think too much about it. She actually thought of this particular Capuchin priest who happened to be away in that period. She thought, oh, maybe it's him. Padre Pio came about 10 years later, and then once he got there and stayed, and then she realized that was him. As a matter of fact, Lucia was one of those victim souls. I think she would be categorized as a victim soul. This is someone who suffers inordinately, and we all suffer in our lives. It's just part of life, but some people suffer more, and some people ask to suffer. Padre Pio was a victim soul, and that's why he had such a close relationship with Lucia. And Padre Pio, we all know that he had the stigmata, and he offered these sufferings for the salvation of sinners and for the healing of the sick. So he had this connection with this woman here, and she was 2 years younger than him. He became her spiritual director, spiritual father. And this was at the very beginning. So in the diary, it's wonderful to be able to read how it sort of developed and how Padre Pio was received. And then unfortunately, if it's unfortunate or not, but she was there at the beginning when Padre Pio was so controversial because all these things were happening in San Giovanni Rotondo, which was this kind of podunk town, and these extraordinary things were happening. So that, you know the story that the authorities came in, particularly from the Holy Office, the Santo Ufficio, which is now the CDF or DDF, and they started to look into what was happening, and they were not favorable in Padre Pio. So for a full 2 years, he was prohibited from having any contact with the public, any contact with his spiritual sons and daughters. He could not celebrate Mass in public. He could not bless. He could not even hear the confessions of the students, the Capuchin seminarians, let's call them, who were in San Giovanni Rotondo. So throughout this period, his spiritual sons, in particular his daughters, were distraught, and they were praying for him constantly, in particular Lucia, who was this victim soul. So she lost most of her family members when she was young. They all died of different diseases and illnesses. She had a brother who was killed in World War I. A very tragic situation. But Padre Pio guided her throughout this and said, you're called to offer these sufferings for Christ. She also offered her sufferings for him and for his ministry. So at the end, she was very sick. And she was, I don't remember the exact year she died, but she was, I believe, in her 40s. So she died young. And she was sick, kind of on her deathbed. I don't know if she knew it was her deathbed or not, but she offered, and she told this to one of her aunts who was there kind of throughout this last illness. She told her aunt that she was offering her these last illnesses for Padre Pio, specifically for him, and that there would be a resolution with the authorities of the Catholic Church that he would be able to come back into good graces with the Church. And we know that Padre Pio was in bad graces, not because of anything he did, but because they didn't understand what was happening. There were a lot of false rumors, there were accusations, calumny, slander, which none of it was true. And shortly after she died, in fact, the authorities reversed the rule. Actually, it was the Pope himself, I believe Pope Pius, who reversed the ban on Padre Pio, which had been instituted by the Holy Office, which is the equivalent of the DDF or the CDF, the highest authority. And these bans are very rarely reversed, but the Pope himself reversed it. And he said, I have not been badly disposed to Padre Pio, I have been badly informed, was kind of his famous line. Now, that wasn't directly related to Lucia Fiorentino. This is something happened spiritually, that she offered her sufferings for his rehabilitation, let's call it. I think we can all of us who are believers, we can have elocution to one degree or another. And she doesn't specify really in the diary. It's not clear how she experienced these. I think we all hear sort of an internal movement of the Spirit, say, God, do you want me to do this? Do you want me to do that? Vocation stories. I felt strongly God saying to do this. So she had, I think, something more than that, because she has these sort of divine colloquy, we say in Italian, with the Lord, and not just the Lord, her angels, some saints, and I think even a niece towards the end. And she'd actually write down these conversations. So I think she was hearing more than just a prompting of the Spirit. She was actually hearing voices, perhaps audibly. These are the highest form of elocution. Like the way you hear me speak now, that would be a very audible locution, at which some saints and mystics do experience that, but those are very rare. So she was definitely a mystic. And what I love about her is how hidden she was, because she was average. Like if you saw her walking down the street, you wouldn't even notice her because she was so average. And she never married. She was a third order Franciscan. And she was badly treated by lots of different people. And I don't think anybody knew what was happening interiorly except for Padre Pio. And she had two spiritual directors who were diocesan priests before Padre Pio arrived. They knew what was happening. It was one of those diocesan priests who actually encouraged her to begin writing the diary. So she had all this stuff going on inside, this incredible spiritual revelations and the sufferings too, which, we talk about these and we talk about how holy they were. But the reality is that it was not so nice. And even Padre Pio, like if you read his letters, he really struggled with his sufferings, particularly in the beginning. It was his spiritual directors who constantly over and over consoled him, and her too. Padre Pio consoled her with her sufferings, said, these are from God, offer them up. You are called to be a victim soul. I'm not sure if he uses, he calls it victim. He doesn't say victim soul. That's more of an English language term we use. But he said, you're called to be a victim. And a victimale type of spirituality. So she had it, she offered it, and she's a model for all of us, especially for those of us who suffer, because there are a lot of people who come to our church and are constantly asking for healings. And sometimes God allows the sufferings to continue for a particular reason. So she suffered greatly, and she's a real model of hiddenness, because the other thing we didn't really touch on is how her diary came to light. You mentioned the letters. She had an extensive exchange of letters with Padre Pio. And she was so humble, she didn't want to be attached to the letters, so she burned them, most of them, and only 6 survived. And then about half of her diary is never been found, but the half that they did find and that I published, I translated it into English and published, was found randomly by one of her nieces, I think 30 years after she died. Just going through some old boxes and happened to find this diary. So the niece went through it and realized what it was. So she published it, I think it was 1956, 55 or something, initially in Italian, then it was republished by a real publisher, and then now it's in the public domain. So I took it and I published it in English, and I have it out on Amazon, and it's under my company, Icona Press, which I have 6 other books in a series of Padre Pio. I call it The Mission of Padre Pio, which I do think, I mentioned at the very beginning that dream or perhaps divine visitation, nocturnal visitation, when Padre Pio touched my hand. Two different spiritual sons who are still living of Padre Pio said that one of them said quite casually, he said, well, he just wanted a hand from you. He asked for a hand, give me a hand. And the other one said, well, he was blessing your right hand. He didn't want the left, he wanted the right, because the right is the predominant hand, which is the things we do things with. I'm right-handed. He said he wanted to make it clear that this was for something you're going to do. So I ask often, Padre Pio, what do you want me to do? I ask Jesus daily, what is your will for me in my life? And I feel this participation in taking these Italian diaries and translating them into English for the English-speaking world, especially the ones that are hidden in a dusty library some way.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.